I'd like to share with you today a message that I received on Facebook. It was from a 14-year-old boy that I met when I was volunteering in a refugee camp overseas. Hi, I don't know if you can remember me, but I will never forget you. I remember one day when I was in the unaccompanied children section of the refugee camp, your shiny smile and your kind words stopped me from killing myself. Thank you for saving my life with your amazing words. Heaps of respect and love for you. I wish you all the great things in life. I cried when I received that message. Can you believe that? My shiny smile and my kind words stopped a boy from killing himself. Something so simple changed his life. Now, how did I come to be volunteering overseas in the first place? Well, volunteering and creating change starts at home. It starts with your neighbours and it extends out into the local community. Then it expands out into the international community. I have volunteered overseas in and helped some of the most vulnerable people around the world. I volunteered in natural disasters, such as Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines and also the Nepal earthquake. I've also helped in Greece at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis and in Iraq during the conflict. But for me, my pursuit for volunteering started at home. Home for me was Groote Eylandt, a remote island in the Gulf of Carpentaria in the Northern Territory of Australia. Groote was such a great place to grow up in. It was a place where multiculturalism and diversity were the norm, where there was a real sense of community and people tended to stick together. They stuck together because they needed to survive out there in such a remote location. Both my parents are Greek and they migrated out from Greece to Australia in the 1970s. My father worked on the manganese mine on Groote Eylandt and my mum supported us at home. We lived on the island until I was about 14. One thing that my parents taught me from my Greek heritage was philotimo. Philotimo is a word that doesn't have an English translation, but it can be defined as being hospitable and giving to others without discrimination and without expecting anything in return. I learnt growing up in a small community and on that small island, and from my parents, that you can show philotimo in your everyday life. I was a little girl when I first joined a volunteer organisation in the community. We went out and helped people in need in the local community. This is where I began to learn about creating change. I learnt how to be creative when we had limited resources. So if someone in the community had an accident and needed a wheelchair and they didn't have one, well, we went out and fundraised and bought them that wheelchair. It was that simple. It was about that age when I realised I was really passionate about caring for people, and I hoped that one day I would go out and become a nurse. So wanting to do that as a career, I would have to further my studies. When I finished high school, I applied to university. I didn't get in. In fact, I didn't get into anything that I applied for. I was devastated, but I realised it was up to me to create the change. So I wrote a letter to the university with the help of one of my teachers, and I asked for them to review the application that I had sent in. Essentially, I was begging them to let me in. In the 3 months that I waited for a response from them, I went to the local ambulance service to do an ambulance course to become a paramedic. It was a TAFE course. And 3 months later, I did get a response from the university. There was a spot in the nursing program and they were going to trial me for the first semester. This was my chance. I was so excited to get into uni. This was my passion and this was my purpose. I would be learning the skills that I needed to go out and care for humanity and to care for people. But my excitement soon faded when all of my essays started coming back to me covered in red pen. And it didn't take long before my lecturer actually called me into her office and she said, "Helen, you're not going to make it as a nurse or a paramedic. You need to quit and pick a different course. Nursing just isn't for you." I was devastated. I was standing in that office completely gutted because I was being told that I couldn't fulfill my dream, I couldn't pursue my passion. I knew that it was up to me to create the change in myself, to prove to myself that I could do it. So as I left that office, I was determined I was not going to quit. I persevered, I persisted, I kept handing in those essays. They kept coming back to me covered in red pen, but I managed to pass them, just barely. And essay by essay, subject by subject, I managed to get through. So I managed to graduate with a Bachelor of Nursing, but I also got my diploma in ambulance studies as well. I stand here proudly wearing this uniform, my nurse's uniform, because I know how hard it was for me to get here. If it wasn't for my perseverance and my persistence and for tackling problems head on, I wouldn't have made it. Everyone has a moment in their life when they realise that they are on the right path. My moment came to me on a Friday night. I was driving into town, heading off to meet some friends, and I saw an accident happen up ahead. It was a chaotic scene. There was a fire truck there, but there was no ambulance yet. There was bystanders running around, desperate, not knowing what to do. I pulled up at the scene, and I was told that a woman had attempted to cross the road and she'd been hit by 2 cars. You can imagine how horrendous her injuries were. I sprung into action, helping the fire crew do all that we could to try and save this woman's life. I used all of my skills that I had learnt both as a nurse and a paramedic. Amongst all the chaos, there was a fireman that kept repeatedly thanking me for stopping to help them. And in that chaos, I remember holding a saline bag and reaching out to a bystander for them to hold onto it for me. And as I reached out, I looked up. It was her. It was that lecturer that had told me that I should quit and that I would never make it as a nurse or a paramedic. She was actually driving the car that had hit this woman that was crossing the road. Sometimes the very people that tell us that you can't do something or that you should quit are the very people that end up needing your help, and they end up showing you that you are on the right path. That was my moment. Creative change isn't just about embracing new ideas. It's about reflecting on old ideas that we might have forgotten about in our busy lives. One of my favourite quotes is from Mahatma Gandhi. The best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. Well, I did just that. I volunteered in the local community. I volunteered in the local ambulance service. And I hoped that one day I could take the skills that I had learnt to go overseas to volunteer. Again, I was told no. I was told I wasn't skilled enough, that I needed more experience. The aid organisation that I had applied to said that I couldn't go overseas. So I made up a plan. I stuck to it, I persevered, I took up postgraduate studies. I went out to Indigenous communities to further my skills. And I even went on to complete my Masters in Emergency Nursing. And eventually, I made it overseas to volunteer. While I was over there, I learnt some valuable lessons. In the Philippines, I learnt the lesson of empathy. It was November of 2013 when Typhoon Haiyan struck the Philippines and absolutely demolished Tacloban. Thousands upon thousands of people were killed. I volunteered. I flew over with a medical team and we set up a makeshift clinic on the edge of a basketball court one day. And I remember standing there, staring out at all the devastation. I was actually standing in the debris and a woman came up to me and she stood next to me. She was wearing an old t-shirt and she looked absolutely exhausted. Her eyes were puffy from crying and from a lack of sleep. She sobbed as she told me that she'd lost her little boy in the typhoon and that she was still having nightmares and she was concerned that the typhoon would come back. There was nothing I could do for her medically at that time, but I stood there and I listened to her. I held her in my arms as she cried. I showed her empathy. In the Philippines, the lesson that I learned is that if you can listen to someone and show compassion and empathy and console that person that's grieving, you can create change. You can make a difference. It was in Nepal that I learnt the lesson of compassion. One of the largest earthquakes to ever rock Nepal struck in April in 2015. Thousands upon thousands of people were killed. Gorkha was just devastated. I flew over with a medical team and we set up a clinic up in Arket, one of the villages up there. The place was absolutely devastated. We endured aftershock after aftershock every day. It was actually quite scary. On one of the days, we had set up a clinic and we were treating hundreds of patients. And I saw a little boy coming up from down the mountain. He was about 8 years old and he had trekked for 4 hours to get to us, enduring those aftershocks and possible landslides to get to us. He was hungry. He was asking for food and he wanted some supplies to take back to his grandparents that were too elderly to come down for help. We were so impressed by how brave he was. You know, when I looked down at his feet, his shoes were old and falling apart and taped together, and when he looked up at me with those big brown eyes, he smiled. He had these 2 front missing teeth. There was nothing medical I could do for this boy, but we sat him down, we fed him, we gave him some supplies to take away, we gave him some guys from the community to escort him back to where he came from, so he wasn't on his own. You know, the lesson that I learnt in Nepal is that if you can feed someone who is hungry and show them compassion, you can create change. You can make a difference. In Greece, the lesson I learnt was kindness. It was the height of the refugee crisis. Thousands upon thousands of people were fleeing Syria and surrounding countries, crossing the Aegean Sea to get to the Greek islands. Being Greek Australian, I felt compelled to go and help when I heard that there were cries for medical teams that needed to come and volunteer. I attended that call, and I was on the island of Lesbos. Thousands of people arrived every day, up to 5,000 on the week, 5,000 arrivals on the week that I was there, or weeks that I was there. It was freezing cold, it was winter. People were arriving soaking wet from the journey across the sea. On one of the days when I wasn't volunteering in the clinic, I was on the beach helping with the boat arrivals. And there was a mother there with her 2 children. They were soaking wet from that boat ride. I remember helping them get changed into dry clothes. And when I wrapped a blanket around the 2 children, their teeth were chattering because it was so cold. They had a look of shock on their faces because they had witnessed people drowning on the journey. The mother's face, you know, she was so frightened when she first arrived. But now that she knew that she was safe, she had a look of almost relief. She squeezed both my hands and thanked me for being so kind. In Greece, the lesson that I learnt is that if you can wrap a blanket around someone who is cold and show them kindness, you can create change. You can make a difference. It was in Iraq that I learnt the lesson of hope. There was still a conflict happening in Mosul, and there was a call for medical teams to come and assist because the conflict was still happening and hundreds of people were escaping. There were camps situated just outside Mosul, and I was in one of those camps, standing inside the clinic. On one of the days I was there, a mother approached me with her child. There was a look of sadness in their eyes. They were traumatised. They were malnourished. She begged me for water to drink. I can't even describe racing inside to get water for these people to drink, something so simple. And as she sat there quenching her thirst, she kept repeatedly thanking me. Through the interpreter, she said that seeing a nurse had given her hope. In Iraq, the lesson that I learnt is that if you can give water to someone who is thirsty and give them hope, you can create change. You can make a difference. All of these lessons changed other people's lives, but they also changed mine. I no longer see nursing as a job or a career. I see it as a way of life. And I also see that there are very fundamental, basic things that we all can do to care for humanity. When people come up to me and they say, Helen, I would love to volunteer like you and create change in the world, but I don't have your skills. I think back to the lessons that I learnt, and I say to them, empathy, compassion, kindness, hope. I say to them, if you can listen to someone who is grieving and console them, you can create change and volunteer. If you can feed someone who is hungry and show compassion, you can create change and volunteer. If you can wrap a blanket around someone who is cold and show kindness, you can create change and volunteer. And if you can give water to someone who is thirsty and give them hope, you can create change and volunteer. One person can't change the world, but together we can all make a difference. So this is my call to action. I challenge you to create change. I challenge you to go out into your local community and volunteer. I challenge you to make a difference to one person. People will tell you that you can't, that it's too hard, or you don't have the skills. But you are the person who can create change in someone else's life. You are the person who can create change in your own life. You are the person who can make a difference. Thank you.